The Premier Grand Lodge of England was founded on the 24th of June 1717 as the Grand Lodge of London and Westminster, later calling itself the Grand Lodge of England.Convention calls it the Premier Grand Lodge of England to distinguish it from the most ancient and honourable society of free and accepted Masons, according to the old constitutions, more usually referred to as the ancient Grand Lodge of England and the Grand Lodge of All England meeting at York. It existed until 1813 when it united with the ancient Grand Lodge of England to create the United Grand Lodge of England. It was the first Masonic Grand Lodge to be created. The basic principles of the Grand Lodge of England were inspired by the ideal of tolerance and universal understanding of the Enlightenment and by the scientific revolution of the 17th century. Foundation. The Grand Lodge was founded shortly after George I, the first Hanoverian king of the Kingdom of Great Britain, ascended to the throne on the 1st of August 1714 and the end of the First Jacobite Rising of 1715. Officially, the Grand Lodge of England was founded in London on St. John the Baptist's Day, the 24th of June 1717, when 4 existing lodges gathered at the Goose and Gridiron Ale House in St. Paul's Churchyard in London and constituted themselves a Grand Lodge. The 4 lodges had previously met together in 1716 at the Apple Tree Tavern, and having put into the chair the oldest Master Mason, they constituted themselves a Grand Lodge pro tempore in due form. Quote, "It was at that meeting in 1716 that they resolved to hold the annual assembly and feast and then choose a Grand Master from among themselves, which they did the following year. All 4 lodges were simply named after the public houses where they were accustomed to meet, at the Goose and Gridiron Ale House in St. Paul's Churchyard, the Crown Ale House in Parker's Lane off Drury Lane, the Apple Tree Tavern in Charles Street, Covent Garden, and the Rummer and Grapes Tavern in Channel Row, Westminster. While the 3 London lodges were mainly operative lodges, the Rummer and Grapes, by the Palace of Westminster, appears to have been primarily a lodge of accepted and speculative gentlemen Masons. The new body became known as the Grand Lodge of London and Westminster, and it is unlikely in these early days that its members had any aspiration to be anything else. Little is known of Anthony Sayre, the first Grand Master, but the next, George Payne, rose to a high position within the Commissioners of Taxes. Payne served as Grand Master twice, in 1718–19 and 1720–21. The year in between was taken by John Theophilus de Saglaliers, a scientist, clergyman, and a pupil of Newton. Thereafter, every headmaster was a member of the nobility, although in these early years, it is unlikely that they were anything more than figureheads. The intention was to raise the public profile of the society, which evidently succeeded. In 1725, aside from London lodges, the minutes of Grand Lodge show lodges at Bath, Bristol, Norwich, Chichester, Chester, Reading, Gosport, Carmarthen, Salford, and Warwick, and embryonic provincial Grand Lodges in Cheshire and South Wales. Grand Lodge was outgrowing London. The Book of Constitutions. George Payne took it upon himself to write the general regulations of a Freemason, which were recited at his second installation as Grand Master in 1720. Very little is known of the period from 1717 to 1721, due to lack of minutes and written material, but sometime during this period the Rev. Dr. James Anderson was either commissioned or took it upon himself to write the constitutions of the Freemasons, containing the history, charges, regulations, and amp of that most ancient and right worshipful fraternity, for use of the lodges. According to to Anderson, he was commissioned to digest the old Gothic constitutions of Freemasonry. The book was submitted for approval to Head Lodge and published by order of the Grand Master in 1723, with the addition of the outgoing Grand Master's method of constituting a new Masonic lodge. It started with de Saglia's dedication to the previous Grand Master, Lord Montague. There followed a long historical introduction tracing Freemasonry back to biblical times, a set of 6 charges, an expanded version of Payne's regulations, Grand Master Wharton's method of constituting a new lodge, and finally a section of songs. For the first time, all of Freemasonry, except for the ritual, was available in a printed book. Anderson received no remuneration from the pocket editions which started to appear in the 1730s, which may have inspired the revised edition of 1738. Expansion and conflict. The new Head Lodge was evidently not immediately attractive to the older St. John's or independent lodges, who already found much to dislike about the organization. It had been their custom to mark the lodge out in chalk, which would be erased with a mop and bucket. This began to be replaced with tape and thin metal letters. Hence an advertisement in a London newspaper in 1726 for a lecture on antediluvian masonry, showing what innovations have lately been introduced by the Doctor and some other of the moderns with their tape jacks and movable letters, blazing stars, etc., to the great indignity of the mop and pail. The second quarter of the 18th century saw the London organization flourish as the Grand Lodge of England. However, the rapidity of growth saw some lodges fail in their first year. A crop of disaffected ex-Masons brought a few published exposures, the most successful being Pritchard's Masonry Dissected, in 1730. As this contained a recognizable representation of all 3 degrees, with the secrets that would supposedly ensure admission to a Masonic lodge. Grand Lodge made a few changes to the ritual and password which took them out of step with the new head lodges in Ireland and Scotland. This also widened the gulf between a relatively new Grand Lodge and many unaffiliated lodges in the country, who viewed with extreme suspicion any departure from the ancient landmarks. When in 1721, the Grand Lodge secured John Montague, 2nd Duke of Montague, as the first noble headmaster, a foot parade was staged at his installation. This became an annual event, with later processions being conducted in carriages. As every notable admission into the fraternity was heralded in print, an aura of elitism attracted scorn, and the annual processions attracted ridicule and finally, physical parody, in the 1740s being followed down the road by the so-called miserable Masons became too much, and Masonic processions were banned by Grand Lodge in 1747. Ancients and Moderns. In 1751, a group of unaffiliated lodges of mainly Irish membership formed the Grand Committee of what would become the most ancient and honourable society of free and accepted Masons according to the old constitutions, now known as the Ancients. This society, which adhered to what it believed to be an older and more authentic ritual than the original Head Lodge, grew rapidly under the influence of Lawrence Ermit, who was Grand Secretary from 1752 to 1771, and Deputy Headmaster intermittently thereafter. It also benefited from early recognition by the Head Lodges of Ireland and Scotland. Ermit wrote a new book of constitutions for his Grand Lodge, entitled A Hymen Raison, published in 1756. The first edition expressed a wish for reconciliation with the other Head Lodge. The second edition, in 1764, turned on their unconstitutional fopperies. The premier Head Lodge were already referred to as the Moderns, and Ermit made sure that the epithet stuck, his own Grand Lodge becoming known to history as the Ancients. Succeeding editions heaped ever more scorn on the premier Lodge. Its prose was bitingly sarcastic and witty. A Human Raison sold well. Also in 1764, a lodge of Edinburgh Masons, who had only joined the previous year, succeeded to the Moderns. These were instrumental in the formation of the first chapter of Royal Arch Masonry. Among the members was William Preston, who within a decade had become a valued writer and lecturer on Masonry. The success in the 1770s of Preston's lectures, and his book, entitled Illustrations of Masonry, led to his appointment as Assistant Grand Secretary, and his election as Master of the Lodge of Antiquity, formerly the Goose and Gridiron, and reputedly the oldest lodge in the Constitution. Preston's position as Assistant Grand Secretary enabled him to correspond with the Grand Lodge of Scotland, casting doubt on the regularity of the ancients, and attempting to sever the ties between the ancients and the Scots. This was a predictable failure, and further poisoned the relationship between the two London Grand Lodges. The huge influx of new Masons at Preston's Antiquity led to discontent among the longer-serving lodge members, and he also managed to fall out with Grand Secretary Heseltine. When he and a few others walked to lodge from church in the regalia one Sunday, his enemies made the incident into an unauthorized procession. Preston unrepentantly cited Antiquity's precedents as a founding, time immemorial lodge, and was expelled, taking half of Antiquity with him. They allied themselves with the Grand Lodge of All England at York, and for 10 years, from 1779 to 1789, became the Grand Lodge of All England south of the River Trent, whilst the new chapter had been set up with the Grand Master, Lord Blaney, at its head. Grand Secretary Heseltine continued to write to provincial lodges assuring them that Royal Arch Masonry had no part in regular Masonry. Although he was himself one of the founders of her chapter, Thomas Dunkley, the Grand Superintendent of the new chapter, had considerable success in spreading Royal Arch, Mark, and Templar Masonry in the southern provinces of the Moderns, and assisted Heseltine and Preston in starting to move Freemasonry out of inns and into dedicated Masonic buildings. The official attitude towards the Royal Arch remained antagonistic, which proved difficult as the two Grand Lodges moved towards union in the next century. Union with the ancients. Relations between the two major bodies in English Freemasonry experienced a thaw in the 1790s. It is hard not to correlate this with the death of Dermot in 1791, and the progressive editing out of his vitriol from a Human Raison. But other factors contributed. John Murray, a fourth Duke of Atholl, became headmaster of the ancients, and Francis Rawdon Hastings, Earl of Moira, became acting headmaster of the moderns. Neither of these noblemen was content to be a mere figurehead, and in 1799 they were forced to act together, in company with representatives of the Lodge of Scotland, to keep Freemasonry from being outlawed. Fear of Napoleon's spies prompted the Unlawful Societies Act, prohibiting any association bound by secret oaths, and the united representations of the three lodges induced the government to make a specific exception of the lodges of Freemasons. Progress towards union remained slow, until the moderns formed the Lodge of Promulgation in 1809, for the purpose of reverting the ritual to a point where it was in step with the ancients, the Scots and the Irish. One of the resolutions was that the ceremony of installation was part of Antient Masonry. They then obliged their own uninstalled masters and the masters of the London lodges to undergo the ritual in 3 meetings during December 1810 and January 1811. That year, the moderns formally told the ancients that they had resolved to return to the older ritual, and a process of union began. At the end of 1812, the Earl of Moira resigned to take up the post of Governor of India, and the Duke of Sussex became headmaster on the resignation of his brother, the Prince Regent. On the 1st of December 1813, the Duke of Atholl resigned the leadership of the ancients. The Duke of Kent, the older brother of Sussex and the father of Queen Victoria, took over. He had already united the ancients and moderns in Canada. He simply merged the lodges of the moderns with the nearest lodge of the ancients. In other words, he abolished the Canadian moderns. So it was that on the feast of St. John the Evangelist, the 27th of December 1813, the two English head lodges came together to form the United Grand Lodge of England, with the Duke of Sussex as Grand Master. Grand Masters